All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining me on the last day of the weed management section for Crop Hour. I will preface this right away that I'm actually at the Ag Expo down in Sioux Falls. So if there's any background noise or disruption, I apologize in advance. But I do want to welcome you all. I appreciate everyone tuning in. It kind of, if you were on yesterday, this presentation will be a little bit different. So I'm going to get the slideshow started. So just a little bit of background on what I'm going to talk about today. So I am still relatively new to South Dakota State, may not be new to weed management as a whole, but starting in March of 2023, you kind of have all of these notions of what's going to be the problems that the farmers, the stakeholders are facing with weed management. And I quickly found out that maybe I didn't really know what was going on. And not saying that I was completely dumbfounded, but it would be better to know than assume. So let's just talk about what's currently being done for weed management in the state of South Dakota. Excuse me. When we think of weed management as a whole, there's a lot of things that go into it. For example, we have many different tactics that we can use to manage weeds. A lot of the times we're very herbicide centric, but we can have biological control. That would be things utilizing living organisms to manage weeds, whether it be insects or mice eating the weed seeds or cattle grazing corn stalks or even in pastures. We also have kind of the cultural control tactics, again, crop rotation. And when I say crop rotation, I mean, and not to say this in a snarky tone, but a legitimate crop rotation, including a winter annual with your summer annuals, including that perennial crop such as alfalfa. If we think about the tactics we use in corn and soybeans, they're very, very similar. The other one we have is mechanical, and that's any tactic that we use to excise that weed from the ground. It could be mowing, it could be hand weeding, it could be cultivation, it could be tillage. And let me turn this off just so I don't uh, run out low on bandwidth. And there's a lot of different things that go on in weed management. It's not really a one size fits all program. So again, it's usually herbicide centric, but there's a lot of different things that can go on with this. Now, the other interesting part about South Dakota is it's a pretty diverse state. If we think about East River, West River, it gets very drastic changes once you cross that river, right? If we think about East River, a lot more row crops. There's some pasture ground. We start getting closer to that river, more rolling hills, a lot more pasture. And as soon as we get cross that river, then we start seeing more of the pasture and more of this, non-row crop land. Now, with South Dakota being quite diverse, think about the different management tactics. We have row crops in the east, we got pastures, more rangeland in the west. So could the tactics actually be different compared to, some of these different regions? So that's what I kind of was interested in, right? It's not going to be a one size fits all program. There's going to be different tactics that can be utilized in these different parts of the state. So the first thing I want to talk about, and I want to talk about noxious weeds. The reason for that being, this is a crop hour. Pasture range is a commodity for our grasslands and our livestock, but I also think at least from the university extension standpoint, from my vision, the pasture rangeland gets kind of forgotten about. So I really do want to talk about the pasture rangeland because, half of the state is pasture rangeland and there's a lot of weed problems there. So specifically for today in the pasture rangeland, let's hone in on the noxious weeds. So noxious weeds are weeds designated by the state government that are required by law to control. We have 7 species statewide that need to be controlled. But again, just thinking about the different geographies and environments across the state, we also have 20 species that are designated locally noxious. Now, the reason why we're going to try to manage these, because if we don't do anything, they spread rapidly and they can overtake an area very, very quickly. Additionally, the management programs for these weeds are very intense. It's not a simple go out and spray once and they're gone. Most of these weeds are long-lived perennials. So just because you kill that top growth, there's still underground vegetation that can be viable. And just because you spray it doesn't mean it's absolutely a sure shot of killing these weeds. Now, how are we going to really determine what's currently going on for not just noxious weed management, but weed management as a whole in the state? So, what I have found through some of my previous jobs in weed management, if you will, is surveys and kind of the social understanding of weed management can be sometimes more insightful than one of the best research projects, because even though you might have done a great research project, if it's not answering the questions or fitting into the production practices of the stakeholders, that does you no good. So what the university pest management extension team did was we created a survey. It was an online survey. We had a few questions that were pre-populated, so it was an easy just click and drop. If you wanted to write stuff in, you can, but the idea was for it to be easy so we could get relatively high responses so we could figure out what's being done for weed management in the state. And from there, it just pre-populated answers for us so we could rapidly get these results out. So just a little background on how we analyze these surveys. I don't really want to talk about the statistics too much, but I think it's important just to give a brief overview of how we analyze these. So the first survey that we're going to talk about was the noxious weed survey. The survey had 9 questions, and if 7 out of those 9 questions were completed, we sent this survey out to, or it was reached by about 500 stakeholders, and about 130 stakeholders answered this question. So about a 26% completion rate, which in my opinion was quite good. Now, from this survey, we also asked, what was your identification as far as stakeholders? And we'll talk about the different profiles, but for example, were you a rancher farmer? Were you a chemical salesperson? Were you just a homeowner or things like that? Also, we had the respondents fill in which county they were from. And from there, we could group that into were they East and West River. Remember, East and West River, drastically different. Are people perceiving weeds or managing weeds different across that Missouri River? Now, the other thing we did was it was called an analysis of covariance. So what we did was we used responses from one question to see if that could predict the response for another question. So for example, we asked, how do you currently control weeds? Okay, so you could say herbicides, hand weeding, mowing, and we used those responses to see if we could predict how satisfied you were with those control tactics. So again, it's kind of like a way to foreshadow or predict some of these other answers. So for example, if you're using hand weeding, you're probably less satisfied than if you were using herbicides, hand weeding, and mowing. That's just an example. Now, getting into the survey results, let's just start with the composition of the respondents as far as how as they identify themselves as a stakeholder. Predominantly, farmers and ranchers were the most common identification for the stakeholders, about 45%. The next common would just be a landowner. And then following that, we had other. Now, this is where the respondents could write in what they wanted to identify themselves as. Commonly, this would be something like a government agency, whether that be South Dakota Game Fish and Parks, uh, the conservatory groups, federal land managers from like Bureau of Land Management and things like that. The other ones we had were homeowners, which about 5%, industry representatives close to 8%, and then county weed supervisors. And we thought it would be really important to include this group in because these are the people that are responsible for controlling noxious weeds on the county level. Just to get into this really quick though, we didn't really see a difference between how the stakeholders managed weeds or responded to our survey, as well as the river. And when I say that, I mean the region. So if they were grouped between East and West River, the responses to the survey really weren't influenced by that, which was kind of shocking, but also interesting as well, just because how diverse these two sides of the state are. So for the remainder of this discussion on that survey, we're just going to be grouping everything together by the region, East and West River, and how the stakeholders responded. Now, we have a relatively small sample size. Again, we only had 130 respondents. There's a lot more land managers than that out there controlling these noxious weeds, but these results still were very useful, and I think they're meaningful for myself, and I also think for the state of South Dakota as well. Now, going to areas managed, we had a minimum of 0 acres managed, all the way to about 1.7 million acres managed. Quite a drastic range. And we saw that because, if you were a homeowner, maybe you don't consider your home lot, to be a substantial land size. But, if you work for some of these federal agencies and you're managing, the Black Hills, that makes sense. On average, the respondents were managing about 43,000 acres. But again, that data is a little skewed because we have 0 to 1.7 million. So we looked at instead of the average, the median, so that middle number, and about 1,500 acres were being managed on average. And that makes a little bit more sense. So if you're just thinking about a rancher or a farmer, it's not uncommon for them to have, pasture areas or rangeland areas on that 1,500 acre size or scale, if you will. Now, the next question we asked was, are noxious weeds a problem on your property or land area managed? These results really aren't shocking. So just to set up the graph, we have the responses on our horizontal or x-axis, and we have the response in percent on our vertical or y-axis. So 80% of the respondents said, yes, noxious weeds were a problem on my area managed, while 20% said no. We found this kind of interesting because, all these noxious weeds, such as Canada thistle, leafy spurge, they're pretty common around the state. So we honestly thought, this question would probably be 100% hit, but we did capture some people that did not think noxious weeds were a problem on the area that they managed. But surprisingly, again, like we said, 7 out of 9 questions needed to be completed to have this survey be considered in this analysis. So even though they weren't seeing noxious weeds as a problem, they still, had some insight for us. So that was interesting. Now moving on to the weeds, right? Again, we have the 7 statewide noxious weeds, 20 some locally noxious weeds. Now, for just the sake of this survey, we did the 7 statewide noxious weeds, which would be absinthe wormwood, Canada thistle, hoary cress, leafy spurge, purple loosestrife, and salt cedar. But we did include the other category because, again, there's 20 some locally noxious weed species. And so we do want to see what some of those species are that are being a problem as well. And that was just to let everybody know what weeds were on this survey. This table is going to just depict all the different combinations of weeds that were selected. And I don't want you to get overwhelmed by this, but a lot of different combinations of weeds were selected. There were singular weeds all the way up to 4 different weeds. So to make this more digestible, I took this and made it into a graph. Now, in this graph, again, we have the response on the bottom axis, in actual answers. And then on the y-axis or the vertical axis, excuse me, we have that response in percent. Now, the most common and troublesome weed that the respondents had was Canada thistle, and that's wasn't too unexpected, very common weed across the state. The next one would be leafy spurge, comprising of about 15% of the respondents, and those are just the single responses. And then these two weeds together were also pretty common as well, right about that 15%. But just aside from these two very common, you can drive east, west, north, south and see Canada thistle. This kind of also foreshadows how many different weed species these stakeholders are dealing with. So for the most part, the respondents are dealing with about 1 species to 2 species. But 3 species, some of these land managers and stakeholders are managing more than 2 species, and a very few are dealing with 4. But again, there's still people out there that have a lot of weeds being a problem. Now going on to management tactics. So this is where I was really interested in, right? I mean, it's pretty intuitive that these statewide noxious weeds are going to be a problem across the state, right? They're a statewide noxious weed for that reason. They're found across the state. But again, what management tactics are being utilized? The tactics that we had, and I should preface this as well, that the respondents for this question could pick multiple tactics. So it wasn't just one tactic and done. If you use 2 tactics, you could select those 2 tactics. If you used all of them, you had the opportunity to use every single tactic or select that tactic for this survey. Now, the responses that were available were burning, herbicides, mowing, insects, so something like a leafy spurge beetle or Canada thistle weevil, removed by hand. That would be, hand weeding, or, everyone's favorite, just grabbing the thistle without a leather glove and pulling up. And then we had other. I do want to say there's one really big management tactic that's missing from this survey response list, and that was grazing. But a lot of these respondents that selected other did write in grazing. So it was kind of a downfall on my part for not including it, but thankfully the stakeholders realized that and put it in as well. Again, I don't want you all to get overwhelmed by the table, but just showing you that, again, a lot of different tactics are utilized across the state to manage these noxious weeds. So we go from the table to the right, we see a graph. Again, set up very similarly. We have the answers on the bottom axis and the response in percent on the vertical axis. Not really a shocker, but herbicides were the most common singular tactic utilized to manage these noxious weeds, coming in at about 25%. But just because herbicides were the most singular used tactic, a lot of these stakeholders are using 2 tactics, 3 tactics. And I would say a good portion, 20%, are using 4+ tactics. So there are many tactics being used to manage noxious weeds. And that makes sense because the programs that are needed to manage these weeds have to be very intense. It's not just a simple spray. If you really want to get on top of this, you got to use all the tools in the toolbox. Next, we asked how
satisfied were you with the effectiveness of control or management with these previously utilized tactics, as you answered in the previous question? So we had completely satisfied, somewhat satisfied, neither satisfied or unsatisfied, somewhat unsatisfied, and very unsatisfied. Most common response coming in at about 45% would be somewhat satisfied. And I think that's a good response. Again, these weeds are difficult to control. I mean, even if you spray in the spring and fall and you mow and you hand weed and you use insects and you graze it, you know, it's still really difficult to manage these weeds. So I considered that a win. But that 15% of very unsatisfied was a bit it was a bit concerning because I think weed management needs to be a community approach. If we think about how weeds move by seeds and spread by, all sorts of different manners, moving hay or what have you, I think it needs to be a community approach. So if we are having people that are very unsatisfied with their weed management, how can we reach them? How can we improve what they're doing? So I think that was a eye-opening result from this survey. Now, as I said earlier, we used how many management tactics do you utilize as a predictor for how satisfied you are with that control. Now, I just want to set up this graph very briefly. Again, don't be overwhelmed by it. But on the bottom axis or the horizontal axis, if we go from the left to the right, that states the respondent used a few tactics up to many different tactics. Going to the vertical axis from bottom to top, at the bottom, they were very satisfied, and as it increases, they were not satisfied. Now, we don't need to get into, the nitty-gritty statistics of it, but if you draw your attention to which way the lines in the middle of the graph go, they're increasing, right? So it starts low and ends up high. So what we found was the more tactics that a stakeholder utilizes, the more unsatisfied they are with control. And this was a really eye-opening result. Because if you look at all the literature, everything I talk about even, we're always harping on using more management tactics for effective weed control. But this survey showed that the more tactics you're using, the less satisfied you are with control. And unfortunately, with these surveys, it's hard to really comprehend this because it's the human dimension. Because is it that they're not satisfied with the control? They have a very high expectancy of what control should look like. Are they just frustrated, or are they using more tactics because they can't control something like leafy spurge or yellow toad flax? But regardless, this was a really interesting result because, again, how are we always recommending managing weeds? Use these multiple tactics. Additionally, what we could perhaps say is a reason for this result: are they using the tactics together incorrectly? For example, are they spraying a herbicide, not letting that herbicide translocate through that weed, and then mowing it off? Or are they mowing it, there's no leaf area, and then they're spraying a herbicide? So that's something else that could be a possible indicator for this different response. But it was eye-opening nonetheless, and we are going to use this to try to help, you know, address these issues of the frustration and using the tactics correctly. Now, the last question on the survey was, what are the barriers of adoption of new tactics? The responses we had, and again, the respondent could choose multiple. So we had cost, effectiveness, labor, and difficulty implementing with current practices. The cost is going to be a really big one, right? As we've seen in production agriculture, everything's increasing. With effectiveness, that's something else that's going to be a barrier too. Herbicides will probably be the most effective, and efficient, I would say. So, are you really going to go out and hand weed, 1,000 acre pasture for thistles? Maybe. Labor, again, a lot of this stuff takes human power. So, if you're a few person operation, maybe you can't do some of this stuff. And then lastly, the difficulty with current practices, there's areas here in the state that aren't easily accessible. You think about like the Black Hills or the Badlands, it's not as easy to go through there with a mower or a sprayer. These results are going to be set up very similar, where we have this table just showing an outline of all the different responses. Again, we can see that there's quite a few different reasons why stakeholders have these barriers to adopt new tactics. So if we look at just one of the most common singular response, and that would be effectiveness at 20%. And again, that makes sense. Herbicides were utilized quite a bit, and those are going to be the most effective and efficient. Again, it's not going to be the only solution we have, but anything outside of herbicides probably aren't going to work as well. So if you have a lot of weeds in these areas, if someone says hand weed, well, it's not going to be as effective as going out and spraying. Most of the survey respondents had about two reasons that they couldn't adopt new practices, but also, we had people with 3 to 4. And it would be really interesting to see, and go back and ask the people. So if you are already doing, 4 management tactics, well, you're really running out of options. There is a lot of tools in the toolbox, but if you're using all of those tools, where else do you turn? The conclusions we have from this survey was, noxious weeds are still a concern in South Dakota, and not really unexpected, but it was good to know, have some of that data to suggest, hey, weeds are still a problem. The big takeaway from this is that there's similar weeds and management tactics used east and west river. I wouldn't have thought that, but at least from the respondents we have on this survey, these weeds are being managed similarly. The management tactics used, there's many of them. As we saw, herbicides were one of the most common, but these stakeholders are also using, anywhere from 2 to 4 different tactics. But are more tactics the answer, right? We saw that the more tactics you use, the less satisfied you were with control. Again, there's a whole nother dynamic, a whole pile of research that needs to be done to understand that social or human dimension of it. But are more tactics the solution? Is it we need to have some more education to teach the stakeholders how to properly implement these tactics together, as used previously as an example, herbicide timing and mowing? Or is it just we need to talk with stakeholders that, 100% clean, doing everything, just the biology of these weeds? You may have weeds that you have to go back out and manage later. Again, it's not a one and done thing. You can put all the management tactics in the world on there, but likely you're going to have to go back out and implement something as well. However, with that one result of many tactics resulting in non-satisfaction with control, most of the respondents were somewhat satisfied with management tactics, and that was good to see. But remember, there were about 15% of the respondents that were completely unsatisfied. So how do we reach them? How do we put out information for them to improve their tactics? Is it, showing them how to use complementary tactics for additive control, or is it just that they're, very particular on how they manage weeds? But moving forward, I want to jump into a row crop survey, which might be a little bit more pertinent to this group. But again, I think that rangeland and noxious weed management survey was quite insightful as well. So let's move on to this row crop survey. the way we gauged how stakeholders are managing the weeds was with a similar survey as the noxious weed one, where it was online, pre-populated with responses, and you could pick which ones were applicable to you. Again, if it wasn't, we had the option to write it in as well. Just going briefly back into how we analyze these, this survey had 10 questions, and if 7 out of 10 questions were completed, we called that survey a success. Now, the one discouraging result I will say is this survey reached over 500 stakeholders, but we only had 33% of those stakeholders that opened this survey completed. So, we're only really looking at 6% completion rate. But again, these results were still pretty insightful, so we'll still present them today. Again, we use the stakeholder profile as an indicator to see how we could predict the responses. You'll notice we didn't have the region East-West River on this survey. One, because minimum amount of survey respondents. Most of the survey respondents were located East River, and that makes sense. So in tandem, since most of the row crops are grown East River, it only made sense, to keep region out of this survey. Now, the other analysis of covariance, again, using answers of previously asked questions as a predictor for future questions. So we asked this one, how do you currently manage weeds, and what are the barriers of adopting new tactics? This analysis would kind of be like if you're using, herbicides and cover crops and all these different tactics, what's being a barrier adopting a new one? Again, is it just the limited amount of other tactics available if you're just using herbicides? I mean, again, is it because you're time constraints or, production practices, things like that? So that's what we were curious on for this survey. Let's jump right into the results. Now, again, these graphs are going to be set up very similar to previous, where on the bottom axis or horizontal x-axis, we have the different classifications of stakeholders. We had farmer, farm manager, crop consultant, farm supply retailer, agrochemical company representative, and other. On this survey, the two most common responses were farm owner and crop consultant, and that wasn't very shocking. It seems like these two types of stakeholders are the ones that are really making the recommendations and the applications, maybe more so for the crop consultants making, the recommendations, but the farmers are also making these decisions and applications on farm as well. The area farmed or managed. So the minimum amount of land area managed was 2 acres, and the maximum amount was 86,000 acres. Just looking at the mean area, again, this data skewed going from 2 acres to almost 90,000 acres. The average amount of acres managed was about 18,000. But the median, or that middle number of acres managed, was about 5,400. That's believable. I mean, if you're a crop consultant, you're probably managing several large farms, and there are large farmers that are managing close to 5,000 acres. On this survey, we asked which crops were grown. So again, this was another question that you could select multiple answers. The crops that were included in the survey were corn, soy, sunflower, sorghum, spring wheat, winter wheat, oats, and other. The most common other would have been alfalfa. On to the results. This table, again, just to show you that there were a plethora of combinations of crop rotations selected. But if we move to the graph, we can see, and that's on the right side, corn and soybean were the most common crops grown. And that wasn't shocking, especially East River. A lot of the survey respondents were on the I-29 corridor, a lot of corn soy being grown there. But we did see, 3 crops grown, 4 crops grown, 6 crops. Or what was shocking to me is, we had these really diverse rotations. And I don't know if we can really say it's a diverse rotation for a farmer, although we had quite a bit of farmers on this survey. But, crop consultants manage different farmers who also have a plethora of different crop rotations. So I'm not sure if we can say it's a 7 crop rotation, but, people are managing multiple crops that answered this survey. The question we asked then was, what is your priority of weed management? Looking at the bottom axis, we have top priority, mid priority, low priority, and not a priority. And then the responses are on the vertical axis. 70% said that weed management was a top priority. Makes sense. If you have weeds, you're obviously going to have, well, you may have a yield reduction. You're going to have a decrease in harvest efficiency. If you're growing a certified crop, weed seeds are not good. You get dinged, you don't get that label. So that makes sense. And then a mid priority, there's other things that go into farming. For myself, I get my blinders on and I really only think about the weed management when it comes to production agriculture. But there's other decisions that farmers and crop consultants and other agricultural stakeholders in the state need to worry about. But what I was really happy to see was nobody said it was a low priority or not a priority at all. So again, these stakeholders in the state, they really see weeds as a problem. And I guess I'm glad to see that. No one's being complacent. People are doing stuff to manage weeds, or at least considering things to do to manage weeds. What are these farmers and stakeholders and consultants using or recommending for management? Again, this was another question that multiple answers could be selected, but the singular answers we had were herbicides, cultivation, hand weed, crop rotation, increased planting density, narrow row spacings, and I forgot it on here, but we had cover crops as well, and then other. Other was mostly, mob grazing on corn stalks, but the tactics used, again, just a very cumbersome table. We had a lot of different response combinations, from the singular to darn near every option that was available on this survey. So stakeholders are using or recommending multiple tactics. And putting this in graph form, the most common response of how many tactics were utilized were 3 followed by 4 to 5. 1, 2, 6, and 8 tactics were utilized, but it was also nice to see that, it wasn't just herbicides. Granted, it might have just been other things like cultivation, again, which makes sense on the 29 corridor. But again, these also had different options of cover crops. We saw a lot of answers that had cover crops, a lot of narrow row spacings, and that was good to see. Again, getting outside of the nozzle to manage weeds. What was interesting though is stakeholder was a accurate predictor of how many tactics a person would use. So for the farm owner, farm manager, and crop consultants, about 3 tactics were used. Whereas if we looked at the farm retail supplier or an agrochemical representative or other, these were actually the entities that were utilizing or recommending more tactics. But again, it was good to see that at least everyone wasn't just relying on herbicides or herbicides and tillage. There was some other facet in there, whether it be crop rotation with a winter annual or cover crops or narrow row spaces. Again, there was another tactic that was used. Moving on to the satisfaction of control. Using these previously answered question or responses or management tactics, we had very satisfied, somewhat satisfied, neither satisfied or unsatisfied, somewhat unsatisfied, and completely unsatisfied. Similar to our noxious weed survey, we saw that somewhat satisfied, being 80% of the response survey, or this 80% of the total responses. I thought that was a win in my book. I would have liked to see the very satisfied increase, but I think it tells the story that why weed management is such a top priority. Weeds are always going to exist. No matter what we do, you know, we can have a real, what I like to call ironclad management program. We may have an escape, we may have a seed come in from a neighboring farm, but these weeds are probably always going to be present. Compared to other pests, there doesn't matter if it's going to be hot or dry, cool, or wet or dry. These weeds are always there. Now on to the problem weeds. This was another one where a lot of different weeds could be selected. So what we had here was water hemp, kochia, Canada thistle, common lamb's quarter, velvet leaf, foxtail species, and wild oat. On to the results, looking at the table on the left. Again, don't spend too much time worrying about that. But again, a lot of different weeds, but mostly weed combinations were selected. And if we draw our attention over to the right of the graph, we see it's usually a few species that are really the problem. And that makes sense, and we'll get to this a little bit later. We usually think of there's, a weed that really drives our management decisions, but there's usually weeds that are present in that field at levels that need to be managed as well. So most common, we had 5 weeds that were a problem. Again, that makes sense because there's usually a lot of different weeds that are out there. And then the next 2 common were at least 2 to 3 different weeds. I was mentioning the singular weed species that usually drive our management plans. And if we look at what were those, not shockingly, a lot of responses of water hemp, kochia as the singular response. And this is in combination of all the different responses. So 15% of the responses included water hemp. About 25% included kochia. Over 55% included water hemp and kochia. So there are other weeds out there, but these 2 weeds, probably not shocking, are what are really driving weed management, right? Herbicide resistance. They're hard to kill even if they're not resistant. They make a lot of seeds. Kochia can tumble around, so even if you don't have any weeds in your field, if your neighbor didn't manage it well, you may have kochia next year. The other one we had was considerations for other tactics. What would you include in your management plan in the future? And not to reiterate it, but these were the same questions we asked for, or we had the same answers we did for how do you currently manage weeds. Just looking at this table, we see there's a whole slew of different answers and combinations that these stakeholders would consider implementing for weed management. I do want to say right now, herbicides, this one was kind of interesting for us. It wouldn't be that they would consider using herbicides and not use herbicides, but likely this is different herbicides, maybe different herbicide traded crops, or using different pre's or different post-emergence, or even different burn downs. Now, going kind of summarizing this, the more common answer for a utilization of a different tactic, it was usually one tactic. And I think that makes sense because, weed management is a top priority, but there's a lot of different things that go into production agriculture. But we did see, people were interested in implementing 2 to 3, heck, even 6 tactics. Now, it may not be in that single year or at a single time, but these stakeholders were at least giving thought to trying something different. And a lot of these were outside of that herbicide nozzle. And a lot of the respondents also just did not provide an answer. Going back to, you may want to implement this tactic, but what's that barrier of adoption? These barriers of adoption were cost. Again, nothing's cheap in agriculture anymore, especially the herbicides and chemicals and machinery. Diesel fuel is not cheap. All your inputs are through the roof. So cost is, that is a very viable barrier, excuse me, of adoption, effectiveness, labor. This stuff takes manpower, and then difficulty with current production practices. So something with this, I think if you're doing no-till, you're probably not going to cultivate. Yeah, rightfully so. But again, we're just trying to gauge what these stakeholders are thinking. So going on to the barrier of adoption, what we saw was cost, effectiveness, and labor as the singulars. Most of it was just effectiveness. And that makes sense because compared to herbicides, just like in the noxious weeds, nothing's going to beat a herbicide application for effectiveness and efficiency. Cover crops work great, but it takes time, it takes effort, it other things like that. Same thing with hand weeding. Hand weeding works pretty good, but it's not effective or efficient to do it on a whole section. But the most common response, and I think this is obvious, but it was nice to actually see this empirical data, was cost and effectiveness. Again, nothing's really cheap in production agriculture anymore. So you got to make things pencil out. $100 an acre herbicide plan is probably really good, but you probably won't implement that because it doesn't pencil out with $3 corn. Same thing with effectiveness, as I stated before. It's hard to beat a herbicide. Although if we use these different tactics together, we use hand weeding, we use narrow row spacings, we use cover crops. Those are effective together, but again, it takes money to do that. The last little bit of we have of this is we use the how many tactics are you utilizing or want to utilize, and then the barriers of adoption. Just sets this graph up on the bottom horizontal axis. If you use is fewer tactics, and as you go right, that's using many tactics. On the vertical axis or the y-axis, excuse me, we have at the bottom few barriers and many barriers. And again, we don't really need to get in the nitty-gritties of this, but there's more barriers of adopting these tactics or new tactics if you already are implementing, multiple tactics, greater than 3. So these using a diverse management plan, it makes sense. There's really not anything else left to use. You're already using a lot of those tools in the toolbox. And that makes sense to us. What could we conclude from this survey? Weed management is a top priority in row crops. Kochia, water hemp are the main concerns. Again, that makes sense. Hard to control, herbicide resistant. Just the biology. These weeds are persistent. Many tactics are utilized, and that was really good to see. At least 3 tactics were utilized on average, but herbicides were part of the plan. And when you think about herbicides being a part of the plan, that's fine, that's great, but kochia and water hemp are probably the biggest priorities or the most common weeds that we're trying to manage. And it's just managing kochia and water hemp with herbicides a recipe for disaster. We'll get into that here in a minute. The last thing I wanted to say, and it's almost a call out, but I think it needs to be said, is the stakeholders are seeing the survey but not responding. I mean, I thought we would have more responses for the row crop survey compared to the noxious weed survey, but it was actually the opposite. Right now we're having a 7% response. 500 people are seeing it, but only 33 have answered it. So I really would encourage you all to answer this survey and tell your friends and family to answer it, because it's helping us. It's helping me realize what the current problems are, what's currently being done, and I can develop some of this applied research to see if we can improve what we're doing to manage these weeds. Now, I want to just leave you all with this. This is kind of going back to, is using herbicides heavily the best option to manage our driver weeds, right? Again, there's other weeds out there. Herbicides are doing a good job, but I think we really need to focus on trying to get outside of the nozzle. I know it's not as effective. I know it's not as cost savings, but let's just use the example of managing kochia and soybeans. So here I have a little chart from our pest management soybean guide, and these are the effective herbicides to manage kochia and soybean. I have a few that are blocked out, but those are the grass killing herbicides. So things like Select or Post, things that have never worked on kochia. Now, if we move forward, I blacked out the ALS inhibiting herbicides, the group 2 herbicides. Kochia's been resistant to those for a long time. They're not working. I also blacked out glyphosate. We have glyphosate resistant kochia in the state. Doesn't work. Okay, we still have some options. But if we take the herbicides out that kochia is resistant to in different states, we only have Liberty left. We really don't have any options. And how we use this herbicide is going to dictate how long it's effective for us. If we use Liberty like we did with Roundup, or we're only spraying Liberty multiple times a year, we're going to lose that herbicide. Well, the other driver weed we have in the state's water hemp. Okay, maybe you don't have kochia as an issue. You're not worried about it. You're near Brookings. You're on the I-29 corridor. Water hemp's your issue. Let's use corn as an example. Again, this little table set up the same. The effective herbicides from the pest management guide for corn, the ones that are blocked out are stuff that was never effective on water hemp. So if we just look at effective herbicides, we got quite a few. We black out, again, the ALS or group 2 herbicides and glyphosate. We have water hemp that's resistant to both of those in the state. Well, that's good. We have options. But again, now let's black out or remove the herbicides where water hemp's resistant to in states that touch South Dakota, Iowa, Minnesota, North Dakota, Nebraska. Similar situation, only Liberty's left. Again, how we use these herbicides and how we use all these other tactics are going to dictate how long Liberty is going to be effective for us. So something else I want to do with this is address these responses for both the noxious and row crop survey, more research on how we can use these different tactics to create good management plans and keep evolving these management plans so we're staying ahead of the weeds. Keep educating stakeholders on the problems. Why aren't you satisfied? Here's how you do it. And potential solutions for why there's dissatisfaction. Something else, I know people don't like surveys, but again, it helps me. It helps everyone in the state knowing what's going on. So maybe survey annually. Having said all of that, there was a lot of people that I want to acknowledge very briefly before I have to jump off and answer questions. But the University Technology Extension team helped put this survey together and put some of the publications out, and I really appreciate that. The South Dakota State University Pest Management Extension, again, very critical in helping develop these surveys and analyze the data. South Dakota Weed and Pest Commission for funding this project, as well as the South Dakota Soybean Research and Promotion Council, also had a part in funding the row crop survey. And lastly, I really want to thank everyone that's responded to this survey. And I don't mean to call anyone out or be ugly about, the lack of responses for the row crop survey, but these surveys really helped me shape and focus how I want to address weed management problems in the state through extension talks and research as well. There's just a scannable QR code. Again, you don't have to use this, but I'm going to use this to kind of bolster again. I would really appreciate you if you told your friends, family, colleagues, neighbors about this survey. You can type in South Dakota State University Weed Management Survey. It'll pop up. Again, it's very simple. It's online. It's not too bad to do. And I think we have about 5 minutes for questions. So I appreciate everyone tuning in, and I'll be happy to take any comments or questions. And I do appreciate you all attending this. It means a lot, and hopefully you found some benefit from it. The question asked is, what is the biggest way weed management has changed throughout the years? That is a really great question. See if I can Yeah, I think that's I don't wanna say it's a loaded question, but I just think the dynamics of it and how we're moving away from things, I would say, about 30 to 40 years ago, we used a lot of cultivation, a lot of tillage, and it worked, but here in South Dakota, especially once you get to that central part of the state, you can't till. You lose too much of that topsoil. We need that topsoil to grow. I think the big challenge has also been since the shift away from cultivation, there was a lot of effective herbicides. If we think about the ALS inhibiting herbicides or the group twos, things like Pursuit, Classic, Harmony, Accent and corn to control weeds, those really made life easy. You could spray that once or twice and you didn't have to worry about anything else. You could grow a crop no-till. We started seeing resistance to that, but in 1996, right at that tipping point of resistance, Roundup Ready crops. It was even more foolproof. Uh, from there, you could spray once, twice, and have clean fields and relatively high yields. But as we move forward, more resistance. Again, in South Dakota, I think we're pretty fortunate with the minimum amount of resistance, and I'm going to contribute that to you all, whether you're a farmer, crop consultant. Everyone I've talked to in the state seems pretty progressive and they understand it's a problem. They're still doing diverse rotations. They're willing to do things to have effective and sustainable weed management. But we still need to realize that just because we don't have these problems yet, they're in neighboring states. These weed seeds move. I think it's going to have to be a challenge, or I don't know. I think the herbicides have been the biggest way that has changed, but the other thing is it seems like there's always been something new that comes out. Granted, 2,4-D and dicamba aren't new, but it gave us options on soybeans, and I think we need to also realize that there's really no new herbicides coming down the pipeline. Most of the new herbicides are in rice. That does us no good. So we're really stuck with what herbicides we have.